I'm not singing. All right, well, it's 10:03. Good morning, everyone. Thank you to all our guests today for your interest in this important report. My name is Duke Shepard. I'm a Senior Policy Director here at Oregon Business and Industry, where I serve as a lead staff in support of our Manufacturing Council of Oregon, which is the state affiliate of the National Association of Manufacturers. We are pleased today to be releasing the latest in OBI's ongoing series of reports on the economic and public policy environment in Oregon. With this, the updated successor to our 2021 report on the state of manufacturing in Oregon. As with that prior report, OBI engaged with Oregon's premier economic analysis firm, Echo Northwest, to research and develop a report that's based on high quality data and impartial analysis. Our Echo Northwest presenters today will be Project Director Brittany Bagent and Senior Economist Dr. Michael Wilkerson. A couple of housekeeping items. This webinar will be recorded. It is being recorded. I am being recorded and posted on OBI's website for anyone who can't make it today or for anyone who'd like to watch it again. There will be time for questions. To ask one, please use the Q&A or chat function, which you should be able to see on your screen. Media members, please direct any follow-up to Eric Lukens, our communications director. My colleagues and I here at OBI will do our best to moderate the discussion as needed, although our presenters will also respond as we go to questions as they're able. We scheduled an hour for this webinar to allow for plenty of questions, but if we end up not needing that time, we'll wrap it up early. Now I will hand it off to Echo Northwest.
Great. Thank you, Duke. Good morning, everyone. It's really nice to be with you. I think we've started to get a little spoiled being in person. So sorry we can't do that today, but excuse me, we'll find another chance to meet in person. So we're really happy to be here today, hoping that this report and this update offers a framework and some context in advance of next week's Manufacturing and Innovation Roadshow. So we'll, like Duke said, offer a lot of numbers, a lot of data, and then offer some time for some discussion. So we can go to the next slide. First wanted to introduce this work and really the purpose for doing this. So the Oregon Business and Industry Research and Education Foundation commissioned this report to really assess current conditions as well as to provide an update to that 2021 report. And back in 2021, it felt as though we were out of the pandemic, but we really weren't. With lagging data and significant supply chain disruptions, this report will offer a more holistic reset of really what's happening. So why is this important? Why is manufacturing important? Manufacturing is a traded sector in Oregon. Its employment brings in new money, wages are higher, employees are more productive. It's a really critical component of our state economy. And this also happens at a time when the US government is implementing on bold priorities and resources are plentiful. So states are able to leverage that work and bring them back to their state. So now is a critical time to assess this. Manufacturing in our state the sector is nuanced with 4 really distinct subsectors. So we'll talk about that a bit. They're performing differently across different regions across the state, as well as workforce and regional dynamics and how they're playing into manufacturing as a whole. So we'll wrap up today with an important purpose in terms of what the implications might be and how the business community and policymakers can really convene around these issues. So next we'll offer just some high-level numbers to kind of set the stage. So Mike, if we can go to the next slide. Manufacturing in Oregon represents 11% of all jobs in our state. It's just over 200,000 jobs. But manufacturing contributes 14% of Oregon's gross domestic product. This means that jobs in the sector are more productive and they contribute more to our state economy than their counterparts in other occupations, which is very important. And then when we're comparing ourselves nationally, the state ranks 19th in its contributions to the US economy, and that's decreased in recent years. So one of the trends we'll unpack today. And another piece on why do we care about this? We care a lot. One reason is median incomes. It's an easy, simple, straightforward metric. and median incomes are frankly higher than they are in manufacturing compared to other industries. So for full-time employees across the state, the median income is $55,700 compared to $65,000 for those working in manufacturing. So we'll go to the next slide. So to offer some context, we'll offer some current national context, but first some history in Oregon and what is manufacturing in our state. Manufacturing has historically played a fairly limited role in Oregon due largely to being so isolated geographically from population centers around the country, and therefore having some pretty high transportation costs for traditionally larger outputs. But that really began to change and shift with the establishment of Kaiser shipyards during World War II, and of course the founding of Tektronix in 1946. So the late 1960s really marked the start of this this historically high timber harvest, and then of course Intel's founding. So Oregon's manufacturing GDP, again, our gross domestic product, reached nearly 1.75% in the mid 90s, and then more recently has started to decline and fall with some pretty sharp pandemic-related declines and only some partial recoveries, which Mike will start to unpack next.
Thanks, Brittany. So again, I think if people have questions along the way and you want to enter them in the Q&A, we can try to respond to some of those as we're going through. Otherwise, certainly happy to engage in questions at the end of the presentation. I think, as Brittany mentioned, this report is looking back at the last 3 years in particular. And I think what we see is that the value proposition and what manufacturing sector contributes to the state is as prominent and important as it ever has been. What we have seen, though, is more disturbing and troubling trends as it relates specifically to jobs, and relative to what the trajectory of the state has been on, a definite pivot. We can see now, looking back, the impact that the pandemic had. And again, we'll unpack this. It's not specific just to manufacturing. It's more broad-based, but certainly manufacturing being one of the largest contributors to the state economy has important implications. And so I think, as Brittany mentioned, what we see here is the state's rank in terms of how important manufacturing sector is to its state GDP. Indiana has been number one for the better part of the last decade. Oregon did achieve a top 10 ranking around 2010, and it has been on the decline. And so when we looked at this report last time, that was clear. And as Brittany mentioned, there's now been further erosion for where we're ranked 19th. So that is really looking at the highest level in terms of how important manufacturing is to the overall state economy. The trend that we now see, but was unclear at the time we did this report several years ago, was certainly what impact the pandemic had. And at the time, looking back to the 1960s, Oregon had significantly outperformed the US in terms of had added jobs, while the US had steadily had an erosion in jobs. 2010 was kind of an inversion point and beginning of more federal policies around stimulating manufacturing nationally. And certainly Oregon recovered starting in and around the same time at a more rapid pace than the US. And that had a lot to do with what was going on. When we look at the data starting in the pandemic period in 2019 into 2020, what we see is a big deviation from the historical trends. And so while Oregon had been outperforming for many decades, starting in 2019, Oregon was more heavily impacted in that first year of the pandemic, lost nearly 6% of manufacturing jobs, while the US lost 5%. And then as the recovery began, Oregon's recovery was slower in every year than the US average. And I think more troubling is certainly looking at the change between 22 and 23, where Oregon lost jobs in manufacturing while the rest of the country gained jobs. So that's that big level, high level, kind of long-term trajectory, and then the recent change since the report we did last time. Several days ago, I think the New York Times did a report talking about, how can the federal government or the election matter in terms of manufacturing sector. So I think this was a timely reminder of kind of why that's significance in terms of framing it in Oregon versus the rest of the country is important. And so again, this data now pushes through a little bit beyond where we had in our data. Oregon, since the pandemic in January 2020, has lost 3.8% of the manufacturing sector jobs. If you look at the map, you can see the colors are kind of the intensity of that. Oregon is the 6th lowest. That is to say, 5 states lost more jobs. Some states lost fewer jobs, and many states actually have grown their manufacturing sector since January 2020. I think what the article did a nice job of framing up is kind of the why is this happening? And what it hypothesized is that traditionally states have focused on local differentiators. So when you're talking to site selectors or business location decisions, those typically were around local differentiated things such as cost and reliability and sources of power, kind of the political environment, and particularly incentives. What many of the people that they interviewed, and one of the quotes here is shown on the screen, is that may be changing now. And instead of companies choosing the right location based on all those requirements that are unique to their business function and the presumption that then workers will come to them, I think what we're seeing in a challenging labor market, and this certainly has changed a little bit in the last few months, that companies now are saying, where do we want to go? Because the people are there already, and that's where people are moving, and that access to labor is an important factor to consider that may not have been a contributing factor before. And so as we start to look at what's happening in Oregon, where we know our population has stagnated and declined in the past several years, as have other West Coast markets, that could be one explanation as to why the entirety of the West Coast is losing manufacturing jobs, whereas places where the population is growing, it could be positively influencing that. Brittany mentioned we have sectors within manufacturing, and we think of in Oregon and more broadly kind of 4 primary sectors, and then there's kind of an other is 10%. So when we're talking about our 4 subsectors, that's really 90% of manufacturing, and they're roughly the same size. And so the largest component of our manufacturing sector is this combination of advanced manufacturing, metals, and transportation. That's about 30% of the entirety of our manufacturing sector as it relates to employment, so 30% of jobs. The second highest is high tech and electronics, which is computer and electronic manufacturing, of which 85% of that is semiconductor. So when we're talking about computers, electronics manufacturing, that's where semiconductors are nested, and they are the largest share of that subsector. And then we have food and bev and wood products are both 19%. And so, again, this is an important kind of just contextualization that we don't have one dominant industry that from an employment standpoint is driving all of our manufacturing. We're relatively balanced amongst those 4. What we can then look at is how have these sectors changed over time? And I think as Brittany teed up in the intro, right, certainly our economy has transitioned in a way that has been very successful and other states haven't been able to emulate, which is when one industry is on the decline, how can they replace that? And we have almost substituted, as wood products manufacturing employment has declined, the growth in high-tech electronics manufacture has more than offset that, which is why we now have more manufacturing jobs than we did previously. And in other states and nationally, that isn't the case. The other 3 sectors have definitely grown. And I think if we look at the last decade, what we generally see is the trends are roughly the same. Wood product manufacturing employment has been stable. We look at other manufacturing as stable, and again, that's a relatively small portion. What we've seen, though, is food and beverage manufacturing employment has increased, and high-tech electronics manufacturing has come down, but stabilized and recovered slightly. So these are the broader trends that we're seeing within our subsectors, but when we roll it up, again, we see cumulative job loss, certainly since the pandemic. So we talked about population. At the state level, we have economic challenges that extend beyond manufacturing. So when we look at the health of an economy, we can start by looking at each of the sectors and say sometimes some sectors are performing well and others not so much. Unfortunately, when we look at Oregon today, if we look at jobs from June 2023 to June 2024, only one state has performed worse than Oregon during that time period, and that's Tennessee. And this isn't a random 1 month kind of anomaly in data. We've been tracking this consistently for the last 6 months. So that is to say from January through June, and Oregon has consistently been in this 49th and at times 50th ranked state. So putting that differently, all other states' economies are growing jobs faster than Oregon, except for Tennessee. And that is not a good thing. I think we can all understand why. What's more troubling, and I think merits further study and understanding, and we're doing that here in manufacturing to a certain extent, is what is happening and why is this impacting all of our industries across Oregon. When we look across the state, there are only 2 industries that are effectively growing jobs at all. That's government and private education and healthcare. And so when we think about our typically most productive and highest paying industries, we do not see job growth in those areas across the state. Why manufacturing is an important contributor to our economy and has outsized influence is largely, as Brittany talked about in the intro, because productivity as measured by GDP is higher in manufacturing than it is in any other industry. So put differently, when you're talking about a job is important, it supports income, et cetera. It also supports the GDP and the productivity in our state. And that is where manufacturing stands out differently than any other industry. The gap today is 59%. So an employee working in manufacturing is going to produce 59% more GDP than the average of all other industries. And I think although we have seen job loss, we have not seen productivity loss. So productivity, the gap between manufacturing and all other industries actually has increased since the last time we looked at this several years ago when it was 41%. And so I think this is just continuing to demonstrate why manufacturing jobs are so crucial to our economy, and why the fact that we are not gaining jobs as we have relative to the US, and in fact have lost jobs, is more troubling for the broader economic success of our state. When we look out at subsectors, we see 2 clear examples of where we excel, and that is very clearly in high tech and electronics, which again is semiconductors. If you look at the share of GDP in that subsector in Oregon, no other state has that subsector contributing more to its regional economy than we do here in Oregon. So restating that, semiconductors are more important to our state economy than any other state, and wood products and manufacturing are 5th in that ranking. So again, when we look at those 2 key subsectors, we can see that they are contributing in an outsized way compared to any other state in semiconductors, and only 4 other states have a larger component of wood products manufacturing than in Oregon. Where we can see that productivity measure is, again, that our location quotient. So again, this is comparing Oregon to the national average being 1. So anywhere where we are greater than 1, that means we have a higher concentration in Oregon than the national average. All of our location quotients are higher, with the notable exception of food and bev, and advanced metals bounces around. In this instance, it's a little bit lower. What that means is those are more productive than they are jobs intensive. And so when we look at those intensities, we can see what is going on. In most local sector, your LQ is going to be 1. And so the opportunity when you're thinking about economic growth is really to differentiate yourself from other states. And that's how you do that, by measuring your LQ being higher. We know, as Brittany mentioned, wages on average are 17% higher looking at median incomes. Median income is not our preferred measure. It's difficult to get at different measures of that. So here what we're doing, and it's animating over time, is looking at locations across the state. So we have regions, Central Oregon, the Portland Metro, the Northeast, the Northern Coasts, Southeast, the Southwest, and the Willamette Valley as regions across the state. And then we can cross-tabulate those by industry. And so the gray bar across each of those regions is the average income in that region. And you can see most of the manufacturing sectors have higher than the average in those regions. So again, this is not a law of averages that only applies in the state or is only specific to the metro region, with semiconductors being so prevalent. This applies in most regions, in most subsectors. Why that is important is that premium is amplified with educational attainment. So that is to say, the returns to educational attainment are higher in manufacturing than they are in other industries. So when we look at, on average, the median earnings is 17% higher. If we look to employees in manufacturing with less than a high school diploma, they get an 11% premium on average. And that goes up every time you add educational attainment. So less than high school is 11%. When you're looking at those with high school diplomas, that gets closer to that historic median, which is about 17%. Associate degrees jumps it up to 19%. bachelor's degrees, 26%, and you really see a huge escalation at graduate and professional degree. And again, a lot of that is in our high tech and semiconductor fields where the returns to higher ed are great. But again, at any level of educational attainment, there is a premium working within manufacturing as opposed to all other industries. This is what we found in the last report and just continues to be the case. I'll turn it back over to Brittany now to talk about some of the regulatory and kind of policy environment.
Great, thanks, Mike. So that was a lot of numbers. We're going to shift away from some numbers here for a minute. I saw a couple of great questions in the chat, so we'll move through this and then address some of those. So it will come as no surprise, given some of the numbers Mike just shared, that Oregon is facing several challenges in attracting investment to support our new and expanding manufacturers in particular. So while we're really strong in semiconductors, we're struggling with other sectors. And we saw in this last year plus, the state really doubled down on semiconductors and allocated $240 million in direct incentives to leverage federal dollars, specifically Federal CHIPS Act dollars. So the federal delegation, state leadership, and industry leaders really worked together to prioritize this work, which should be considered a model for what could be to come in the future. But recent changes have created a lot of uncertainty from rising housing costs, policy changes, and more traditional quality of life benefits that some might say have been eroding. This is particularly evident particularly heightened in the metro area, with Portland having the highest effective tax rate in the country. And previous OBI research is pointing to state business tax burdens rising over 40% over the last few years, specifically between 2019 and 2022. So feeling this across the state as well. But with housing throughout the state being very expensive and contributing to Oregon being among the lowest state for home ownership, and together, these elements are really making Oregon an expensive place to live and do business. So it shouldn't be surprising to see some of these recent trends. Go to the next slide. So now's the time to really lean into this space. So as Mike explained, Oregon's manufacturing sector is so highly productive and worthy of priority and priority investments. So between those wage premiums, new money entering our communities through traded sector activity, and the innovations that are spurred from this work, manufacturing is really playing an important role in our state economy. So the Oregon Business Plan's 21st Century Manufacturing Agenda offered several priorities, which I'll touch on here briefly, and they fall into three primary categories of land, taxes, and workforce. So land, and I saw a question about land, our state has a scarcity of shovel-ready land, and that continues to be a problem. We talk to businesses all the time, all across the state, across all different kinds of sectors that are actively getting recruited out of state with the promise of free shovel-ready land. And this has some significant implications for businesses wishing to scale and expand. Tax-wise, our state invests in economic development in different ways than other states do. States approach these things differently, but Oregon just doesn't compete on incentives like some other states do. While we do have some incentives when a company is looking to expand or relocate to, say, a state in the Southeast, Oregon just isn't competing. And state and local tax rates are exceeding average levels, and they're exceeding even our neighboring states, specifically Washington, Idaho, and California. So if a company is looking again to expand out of state, our neighboring states might be offering a better value proposition for them. So it's important to distinguish that while Oregon may never be a low tax state, but it needs to be a high value state so that people and businesses really feel that value proposition is worthwhile. In workforce is really fascinating in manufacturing, and all of you work in this space. So I'd be interested to hear more, but we're seeing accelerating retirements, increasing, certainly in technology with robotics and automation, the manufacturing workforce really needs more talent development and workforce support. So we see the key to that as effectively working our employer-led consortiums, really connecting the dots and elevating those priorities that are shared by industry, by education, by workforce leaders, and working together on those. So let's do a few key takeaways and then answer some questions. So Oregon's at risk of losing its position as being a leader in manufacturing and really reversing this historical trend as of the last few years. But manufacturing really remains critical to the state's economy, and it's worth fighting for. The state is facing pretty widespread industry and population decline, which is contributing to manufacturing lag and other industry lag. Oregon lost population and barely added any jobs overall last year, which is a reversal from previous national economic expansions. So for the past few decades, economic and population growth have happened pretty naturally in Oregon without explicit strategies to address them, but this time is different. So if we as a state want to grow the manufacturing sector, we'll need to focus and be more strategic than the state has been in the past. But we know that Oregon can work together and really advance manufacturing. It's been done before with semiconductors, and I think we're equipped to do it again. As Mike shared, the gross domestic product of high-tech electronics is higher in Oregon than any other state, which exhibits that the state is capable of doing this if we strategize and implement collectively on these things. And finally, this interesting notion that manufacturing companies are going to be locating where talent want to be. And I think that professional services and software really rode this wave in the 2010s before the pandemic, with companies really investing in high amenity cities and office spaces. And it looks like we'll start to see manufacturing increasingly locating where workers find value and want to live. So with that, we can open up a few questions. And Duke, do you want us to run us through these, or do you want us to respond in the chat?
So I don't know if you can, sorry, I had to figure out my unmuting. Yeah, there are a few in the chat. So, and I'll just scroll through them. I don't know if you can see them. With Oregon's goals of limiting our impact on climate, where does recycling land as an impact on our economy? Is it trending to increase?
Not sure if I entirely understand the question. I don't know if this is looking at infill or, oh, Randy Miller's with us today, looking at infill or some other uses. I can share, we were a part, helped support the governor's recent task force on clean tech manufacturing, and clean tech is a space where the state is really starting to lean in and strategize around. And unlike semiconductors, clean tech includes companies that need all different kinds of land, all different sizes, and all different types of utilities, whereas semiconductors had a pretty singular land use type. So we'll start to see more manufacturing, particularly more R&D that can use some of the smaller sites around the state that won't need those large 200+ acre flat shovel-ready sites that semiconductors were needing. So I'm not sure if that's answering it. Or Mike, if you have anything else to add. But
No, I think that was a good answer. Do we want to jump into some of the next questions here? Or Duke, you want to read them? I think we can see them now, so we can step through them if that's easier.
All right, if you can see them, I will stay out of your way.
All right, so I think the next question was, high growth states have been able to ramp up housing production. How does housing availability affect ability to retain and attract workers? I mean, I think we've always known that that was important, and I think we see that in kind of the post-pandemic migratory patterns being, hugely impacted by affordability. I think, as Brittany mentioned, we're seeing growing kind of sentiment that workforce has been a challenge, and so rather than looking to attract workers to a place, you can go to places where workers already are, and there's abundant and trained workforce. But we know that, population growth and jobs are very related. It's not that one directly leads to the other, but it's very difficult, let's say, in a state where you're losing population of your employed workforce to also be gaining jobs. And I think housing is certainly one of those reasons that's contributing to that. Brittany, you want to do the next question?
I'll respond to Randy. Thanks, Randy, for the feedback. And then looks like Paul is asking about if Intel places a new plant in New York or frankly anywhere else, how that figures into these statistics. So we know that Intel expanded in Ohio and is certainly looking elsewhere. At least in the case of Ohio, it was largely that manufacturing space rather than research and development space. So I'm not keyed in on Intel's decision making, but they represent a lot of different elements of the workforce. And so I think it would depend on, is that largely a manufacturing presence or an R&D presence, and what they would look for, certainly in terms of incentives and land and so forth. Like, I don't know if you've talked to those folks lately.
No, I mean, I think part of the challenge when you're talking about economic development is, how much of that is a zero-sum game, which is to say you take jobs from somewhere else and that's just a net loss to one place and a net gain to another place. I think CHIPS Act and other kind of incentives of that nature are much more aimed at growing the pie rather than a redistribution effect. So I think, whereas Oregon is been successful in, I think, attracting investments from other places with state and federal leverage. Increasingly, I think the governor is realizing that land availability is a constraint to that. And so through SB4, looking at doing a targeted expansion to support some of that, I think those are all additive growth opportunities. And the fact that other states may also be growing isn't necessarily a detriment to our state. Okay, next question, I think, is movement of manufacturing to places where people want to live is okay, but how does a business-friendly climate figure in? I hear from many companies that the West Coast is not friendly. Yeah, no, I mean, I think traditional site selection kind of criteria have been around the competitiveness and whether that's a tax-only environment or, as Brittany is saying, increasingly a tax value proposition, I think, as well as any incentive or subsidies that can be offered. But I think, yeah, companies are looking at it more holistically now, where it's not just a single issue factor. And I think, the competitiveness of any state is going to be really important, as are the availability of a trained and skilled workforce, as well as other factors around livability here. Okay, I think we have one more question.
Yeah, from Paul asking about the basically the data. So yeah, so Intel and Daimler, yeah, I don't know, Mike, if you can explain
Yeah,
that.
no, absolutely. So
Versus
you have
use.
multinational corporations with headquarter locations all over the place. What the data that we use here is looking at workers in Oregon. So the headquarters location of a company doesn't matter. What's increasingly challenging, I think, is work from home. And in manufacturing, you have a range of corporate function to actually, in fabricating kind of professions, which are much more in person. But I think this data is really capturing, what is going on in terms of actually economic activity in all of our regions of our state. And so, yes, they do count Intel and Daimler jobs here.
There was one more question from Tammy in the Q&A asking about the impact of environmental regulations and costs associated with Clean Air Oregon, increased fees, and so forth. And yes, all of that is a part of business friendliness. And so, and we can drop the link to this New York Times article that Mike cited earlier that came out ironically just a couple of days ago. But all of that plays a part into it. So while we didn't quantify that specifically, the business friendliness and the ease of doing business, as well as the kind of known entities and known or unknown surprises are really hindering to businesses, and particularly if we're looking at permitting and so forth. And so it's challenging to particularly expand a business in Oregon, and some of these barriers have been challenging. But I can add that to the chat.
It looks like we have another question from Randy, and then Tammy with a follow-up question. So Randy's question was, do you have any thoughts on how CLT, so cross-laminated timber innovation, can affect the wood products industry? I think we already see returns to Oregon's intentional efforts around that through funding research and R&D, that the wood products sector in Oregon has been growing. I think increasingly the goal is to do something, let's say, similar to semiconductors, where we have an outsized weight. You can see today we're 5th in terms of our relative competitiveness in terms of what we're doing in the state, and that has been trending up. I think as CLT and other mass timber become more commercially used in housing and other commercial real estate, that's going to be a benefit to the state, absolutely. Tammy's question, which I think is top of mind for a lot of people right now, the measure on the ballot, so measure 118, around 3% gross receipts tax on companies with sales in excess of 25 million. What impact will that have on the state? I think there's a comment that OBI will be in Salem for a panel on the issue. What else are we doing on this tax? So, I mean, I certainly can defer to the OBI team to talk in more specifics, but I think, you know, broadly speaking, there's increasing amounts of research on this, including produced by OBI. The state's Legislative Revenue Office put out a study talking about the negative economic impacts associated with that measure, and that what it does is it taxes gross sales, and although it's targeting industries with 25 million or more, oftentimes in supply chain, there are companies below that target. And so as you have every state of transaction that occurs, that tax on the gross receipts is hit. It's not on value add, it's not on margin. So economists think of this as a pretty inefficient tax, in effect, almost like a sales tax, and that it can pyramid, which is to say it can be applied at multiple stages of transactions. And so though that 3% number is a little bit misleading, because that number, as it affects the end purchasing consumer, can be higher than 3%, could be pyramided 2 and or 3 times. And then that incidence is what the relative question is. And so Legislative Revenue Offices looked at this, and it would show that it would decrease jobs, increase inflation, have negative impact on a variety of factors, including very detrimental impacts, as this particular measure is worded, on state resource, general fund, and other things. So I think, you know, broadly speaking, economists have looked at these types of measures. This would be the furthest reaching of any measure of this type anywhere in the country. And so where you see negative outcomes elsewhere, I think the implication is this will be even worse than that. And maybe turn it over to anyone at OBI specifically if there's further comments. I know there's a lot of research here. Angela and team have been doing a lot of work on this, so I'm sure could be providing additional resource. I think that looks like all of the questions. I'll give a moment or two to see if there's anything else, but appreciate the opportunity to present and engage. And if not, we'll turn it back over to Duke.
All right, well then, as I said, if we ended up wrapping up early, we would wrap up early. If there are no immediate further questions, we will thank Echo Northwest for this excellent presentation and research. The report and this webinar presentation will be on our website. We will be distributing the report far and wide, and using it to reinforce OBI's efforts to expand our economy and make Oregon a great place to do business and create jobs. We have some work ahead of us. Oh, all right. Thank you to everyone who attended. Please do share this report with your networks and friends and family, and we will continue to work to use it with our agenda. So thank you all again, and have a good day.